Professor Marcus Steele adjusted his biomask one final time before entering Lecture Hall Gamma 7 at the prestigious Galactic Institute of Advanced Sciences. The synthetic skin felt strange against his face, but after 3 years of teaching xenobiology to alien students, he'd grown accustomed to the deception. His falsified credentials listed him as a Terran-descended colonist from Proxima b, close enough to human to explain any behavioral quirks, but far enough removed to avoid suspicion. The lecture hall buzzed with the usual mix of species. Tall, crystalline vexeri clinked softly as they moved, their translucent bodies refracting the overhead lights into dancing rainbows across the walls. Bulky crethans, with their rock-like exteriors and glowing orange eyes, sat in specially reinforced chairs designed to support their massive 3-meter frames. The serpentine salith coiled gracefully around elevated perches, their forked tongues tasting the air with scientific curiosity, while smaller insectoid zephyrians clustered in groups, their compound eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "Welcome, class, to Advanced Evolutionary Biology," Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the hall's sophisticated acoustic enhancers. "Today we'll be examining adaptation strategies across different planetary environments and exploring what truly defines evolutionary success." A crystalline hand shot up immediately. HFY, one of his most vocal vexeri students whose internal bioluminescence always flared when they had something to say. "Professor Steele, will we be covering any of the primitive species from the Outer Rim territories? The ones that haven't achieved proper civilization yet?" "Define primitive," Marcus replied carefully, though he already knew where this conversation was heading. The vexeri's internal light pulsed with what Marcus had learned to recognize as amusement. "Oh, those species that never developed proper space travel, advanced computation, or even basic psionics. The evolutionary dead ends that somehow think they're relevant to galactic civilization." Several students chittered, clicked, and hummed in various forms of agreement. Marcus felt his jaw tighten involuntarily but maintained his carefully cultivated professional composure. "Evolution doesn't recognize dead ends, HFY. Every species that survives has found successful strategies for their environment. But please, give me a specific example of what you consider primitive." "Humans." The word exploded from Grex, a particularly arrogant crethan seated in the back row whose orange eyes always flared when he was about to make a pronouncement. "Those bipedal mammals from the third planet of the Sol system. They've barely figured out basic combustion engines, still fight wars among themselves like animals, and somehow think they're ready for galactic civilization." The class erupted in various forms of alien laughter, crystalline chimes from the vexeri, grinding rumbles from the crethans, and sibilant hisses from the salith. Marcus waited patiently for the noise to die down, his expression remaining neutral despite the fire burning in his chest. "Humans," he repeated slowly, letting the word hang in the air. "What specifically makes you classify them as primitive, Grex? Where do I even start?" Grex's orange eyes flared brighter with enthusiasm. "No natural armor plating, no psionic abilities whatsoever, no enhanced strength or speed. They can't even survive in most standard atmospheric conditions without crude artificial assistance. They're basically walking meat sacks with delusions of grandeur." More laughter rippled through the hall. Marcus walked slowly to his desk, deliberately taking his time to pull up a holographic display showing various species' physiological data. "Interesting perspective," he said, his tone remaining academic. "Before we dismiss any species, let's examine what you call primitive traits through a more scientific lens. Can anyone tell me the average lifespan of a baseline human?" 70 to 80 of their solar years, hissed Esesthera, a Salith student whose scales always darkened when she was being condescending. "Pathetically short compared to our 300-year lifespans." "And yet," Marcus said, manipulating the hologram to show comparative developmental data. Humans reach reproductive maturity faster than any species in this room, can survive on a wider variety of food sources than most galactic species, and demonstrate remarkable ability to adapt to extreme environmental conditions with minimal technological assistance. Are these truly the traits of a primitive species? Zexhi's internal light dimmed skeptically. Raw adaptation is irrelevant if the species lacks the intelligence to advance beyond their planetary boundaries. What good is survival ability without the mental capacity for true civilization? Marcus smiled, the first genuine expression he'd allowed himself since entering the room. We'll explore that assumption thoroughly throughout this semester. For now, let's begin with our first case study: survival strategies in hostile environments. He pulled up images of various extreme locations. The sulfur fields of Kepler 438b, where the thermophiles thrive. Each of these environments has been successfully inhabited by different species using various adaptation strategies. Your assignment for next week is to research one species that you personally consider primitive, by your own definition, and provide a detailed analysis of their survival strategies, resource utilization patterns, and problem-solving capabilities. Can we choose humans? Grex asked with obvious mockery, his rocky exterior scraping against his chair as he leaned forward. This should be thoroughly entertaining. Certainly, Marcus replied, keeping his voice level. In fact, I actively encourage it. But I expect rigorous scientific analysis, not prejudicial assumptions based on incomplete data. As the students filed out of the lecture hall, chattering among themselves about the amusing prospect of studying stupid humans in academic detail, Marcus remained at his desk. He pulled up his personal files, carefully encrypted and hidden behind multiple layers of security protocols, containing detailed information about his real home, Earth, the planet these students considered a backwater populated by primitive fools. Marcus had been among the first wave of humans to successfully infiltrate galactic academic institutions 3 years ago. The Terran Union's Deep Cover program had methodically placed agents throughout known space, gathering intelligence and quietly advancing human interests, while the galaxy remained blissfully unaware of humanity's true capabilities. Most aliens had never encountered a human in person. Their opinions were based entirely on heavily biased and deliberately incomplete. The following week, Marcus watched with barely concealed anticipation as his students shuffled into the lecture hall. The atmosphere was noticeably different from the previous session. Less casual arrogance, more focused curiosity. Several students clutched data tablets containing their research on primitive species, their body language suggesting they discovered things that didn't quite match their preconceptions. Grex lumbered in with obvious satisfaction, his orange eyes glowing brighter than usual, a sure sign of Crethan pride in what he clearly believed was a job well done. Tala, the insectoid Zephyrian, buzzed nervously as she took her usual position near the front, her compound eyes constantly shifting between her tablet and her classmates. The Vexery students clustered together, their crystalline forms chiming in low harmonic conversations that Marcus couldn't quite decipher but recognized as agitated discussion. "All right, class," Marcus began, settling behind his podium with deliberate calm. "Let's hear your findings. Grex, since you volunteered so enthusiastically to research humans, please share your discoveries with us." The massive Crethan rose to his full 3-meter height, his rocky exterior scraping against his reinforced chair with the sound of grinding stone. "Professor, this assignment was almost insultingly easy. Humans are even more pathetic than I initially thought, though I did encounter some puzzling inconsistencies." Several students clicked and hummed in amusement, though Marcus noticed the laughter was less enthusiastic than the previous week. He nodded encouragingly. "Please, elaborate on both your research methodology and your findings." "I accessed the official Galactic Survey Corps' reports from their comprehensive visits to the Sol system," Grex announced proudly, consulting his tablet. "Their detailed biological scans confirmed everything we suspected. Humans possess no natural weapons whatsoever. No claws, fangs, venom, or armor plating. Their sensory capabilities are laughably limited compared to most sapient species. They can't see in ultraviolet or infrared spectrums, can't detect electromagnetic fields, and their hearing range is remarkably narrow. Fascinating, Marcus said with carefully neutral tone. What else did your research reveal? Their technological development appears to be centuries behind current galactic standards. Grex continued, warming to his subject. They still rely on primitive. Zexhi's crystalline form chimed in agreement, their internal light pulsing with scholarly excitement. I reviewed the same reports for comparative analysis. Their planet is barely unified politically. They actually maintain over 200 separate nation-states that constantly compete for resources instead of working together with proper efficiency. Their military technology is particularly primitive, added Thera, her scales rippling with disdain. Kinetic weapons that fire crude metal projectiles, explosive devices based on simple chemical reactions, and vehicles that require constant fuel consumption. It's like observing a species still trapped in their early industrial development phase. Marcus walked slowly around the room as his students continued their presentation, noting the subtle changes in their demeanor. Each criticism of humanity felt like a small knife twisting in his chest, but he reminded himself that their current ignorance was exactly what humanity was counting on for the success of the infiltration program. These are all observable facts from the official galactic survey reports, he said carefully. But did anyone dig deeper into historical development patterns or behavioral analysis beyond the surface observations? Grex consulted his tablet with a slight frown creasing his rocky features. I did encounter some interesting anomalies in their developmental timeline that don't quite fit standard evolutionary models. Such as? Marcus prompted, fighting to keep his expression neutral. Well, according to multiple independent historical databases, humans progressed from basic agricultural civilization to achieving spaceflight in only about 10,000 years. That's extremely fast for a species without psionic enhancement. How fast, exactly? Marcus asked. Most known species require 50 to 100,000 years to achieve spaceflight after developing stable agriculture. The Crethans took nearly 200,000 years, and we had significant advantages in terms of natural durability and strength. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Marcus waited patiently, letting the implications sink into their minds. But that's obviously an error in the historical record databases, Grex quickly added, though his voice carried less certainty than before. No truly primitive species could advance that rapidly without external psionic enhancement or direct assistance from more advanced civilizations. What other anomalies did your research uncover? Zexhi's internal light pulsed with uncertainty. Their population density patterns are highly unusual. Despite having no natural predators capable of meaning what, exactly? Meaning they've successfully avoided the standard pattern of exponential population growth, followed by catastrophic resource depletion and population collapse that affects virtually all developing species during their pre-spaceflight phases. Marcus nodded slowly, encouraging them to continue. Anything else worth noting? Thera shifted uncomfortably on her elevated perch, her serpentine form coiling with obvious unease. The linguistic analysis produced strange results. Humans have somehow developed over 7,000 distinct languages on a single planet. Most species develop one primary language and perhaps a few minor regional dialects. And what's the significance of such extreme linguistic diversity? It suggests. The Salith paused, clearly reluctant to continue down this line of reasoning. It suggests cognitive flexibility and cultural adaptability that exceeds normal evolutionary parameters by a significant margin. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. These are excellent observations, all of you. You've identified several significant statistical anomalies that directly challenge your initial assumptions about human primitiveness. For next week, I want you to dig much deeper into these anomalies. Don't rely solely on the galactic survey reports. They only provide surface-level observations from brief visits. What additional research sources do you recommend? Asked Zexhi. Historical development databases, detailed anthropological studies, comparative evolutionary analysis across multiple species. I want you to build comprehensive profiles of human problem-solving capabilities, adaptive strategies, and survival responses under various stress conditions. As the students filed out of the lecture hall, Marcus could hear them muttering among themselves about the additional research requirements and the puzzling inconsistencies they'd already discovered. What they didn't realize was that he was methodically leading them toward a revelation that would completely shatter their preconceptions about humanity and force. Marcus arrived early to his office the following week, knowing that several students had requested private meetings to discuss their expanded research. The first knock came precisely at the scheduled time. HFY's crystalline form was nothing if not punctual. "Professor Steele," the Vexery began, their internal light flickering with uncertainty. "I've encountered some discrepancies in the human research data." "Please sit." Marcus gestured to the specially designed chair that could accommodate HFY's crystalline structure. "What kind of discrepancies?" "The historical timeline doesn't make sense," HFY said, their voice carrying harmonics of confusion. "According to multiple independent sources, humans developed from basic tool use to interplanetary travel in less than 3,000 years. Marcus leaned back in his chair, maintaining a carefully neutral expression. "That does seem rapid. What's your explanation?" "I don't have one," HFY admitted. "The Vexery required 15,000 years to achieve the same technological progression, and we had significant advantages: crystalline matrix storage allowing perfect information preservation, hive-mind communication for coordinated research, and naturally occurring piezoelectric energy generation. And humans had none of these advantages? Worse than that, they had active disadvantages. No telepathic communication, no racial memory, limited individual lifespans, and worst of all," HFY paused, their form dimming. "Yes, they spent significant portions of their development period fighting each other. Major wars, genocides, resource conflicts. Any logical species would have gone extinct from internal conflict long before achieving spaceflight." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "What's your hypothesis?" "I don't have one that makes sense," HFY admitted. "Either the historical data is completely fabricated, or humans possess some adaptive mechanism that isn't apparent from surface observations." The next meeting was with Grex, whose rocky exterior couldn't quite hide his obvious frustration. "Professor, I think there's been some kind of systematic error in the human research databases," the Crethan announced without preamble. "What makes you think that?" "The survival statistics are impossible," Grex said, consulting his tablet with obvious irritation. "Humans have established permanent settlements in environments that should have killed them within days. Such as Antarctic research stations in temperatures below -60 degrees. Marcus waited for Grex to continue. "But that's not the strangest part," the Crethan went on. "They've done all of this using primitive technology. Fabric clothing instead of environmental suits, basic heating systems instead of atmospheric processors, and simple tools instead of automated survival systems." "Your point?" "My point is that the Crethans, with our natural armor and enhanced strength, require advanced environmental suits to survive in conditions that humans apparently handle with blankets and fires." Marcus almost smiled at the bewilderment in Grex's voice. The final meeting was with Sci-fi, whose serpentine form coiled nervously around her chair. "Professor," she began, "I've been analyzing human behavioral patterns, and I think they might not be entirely sane." "That's quite a statement. What evidence supports this hypothesis?" "Their response to danger is completely counterintuitive," Sci-fi explained. "When faced with threats significantly larger and more dangerous than themselves, humans don't flee or seek assistance from their pack. They attack." "Attack?" "There are documented cases of individual humans attacking creatures 10 times their size with nothing but primitive weapons. Large predators, natural disasters, even hostile environmental conditions. Instead of avoidance strategies, they seem to prefer direct confrontation." Marcus leaned forward with interest. "And this suggests insanity? What else could explain it?" "They have recorded instances of humans deliberately seeking out dangerous situations for recreational purposes. Mountain climbing, deep-sea exploration, extreme weather survival, activities with high mortality rates and no survival benefit. Perhaps they derive some adaptive advantage from risk-taking behavior?" Sci-fi's forked tongue flicked out uncertainly. That's what I thought initially, but the pattern is too extreme. They don't just take calculated risks, they actively seek out impossible challenges. Marcus stood and walked to his window, looking out at the alien cityscape beyond the campus. What if what you're interpreting as insanity is actually a survival strategy you don't recognize? I don't understand. Consider this. A species that actively seeks out challenges and impossible situations would develop problem-solving capabilities far beyond what would be necessary for simple survival. Sesesthera was quiet for a long moment. You're suggesting that human insanity is actually adaptive behavior? I'm suggesting that maybe your definition of logical behavior is too narrow. After the last student left, Marcus locked his office door and activated his personal encryption protocols. His weekly report to Terran Command would make interesting reading. Phase 2 complete. Marcus began the next week's lecture with a deceptively simple question that he knew would fundamentally challenge everything his students believed about evolutionary biology and species development. Class, I want you to temporarily forget everything you think you know about evolutionary advantages and survival strategies, he said, walking slowly around the room while observing their various forms of alien body language. The tension in the hall was palpable. Word had spread throughout the academic community about the disturbing inconsistencies students were discovering in their human research. Today we're going to examine a purely theoretical scenario that may challenge some of your basic assumptions. He paused at the central podium, making eye contact with each species group in turn. Imagine a hypothetical species with no natural weapons, severely limited sensory capabilities, extremely short lifespans, and absolutely no psionic abilities whatsoever. How would such a species not just survive, but actually thrive and expand throughout a hostile galaxy filled with more advanced competitors? Grex's orange eyes dimmed skeptically, his rocky exterior scraping against his reinforced chair. Such a species would inevitably go extinct within a few generations unless they had powerful external protection from more advanced civilizations. Assume they had no external protection whatsoever. The display showed branching pathways and interconnected backup systems, creating a web-like pattern of redundant capabilities. For example, instead of developing natural armor plating like the Crethans, they might simultaneously develop portable armor systems, sophisticated defensive tactics, advanced avoidance strategies, accelerated healing capabilities, and rapid adaptation protocols. That's completely inefficient, Grex objected, his voice carrying harmonics of professional disdain. Specialized solutions are always more effective than generalized approaches in any given situation. Are they necessarily? Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. Specialized solutions work perfectly in specific, predictable circumstances. But what happens when environmental circumstances change rapidly or unpredictably? He manipulated the display to show various environmental shifts, threats, and challenges appearing and disappearing in rapid succession. A species with natural armor plating is perfectly adapted to their current environment and specific threat matrix. But if that environment changes, different predators, new toxins, altered atmospheric conditions, unknown pathogens, their highly optimized specialization can become a critical weakness. Zexhi's light pulsed with growing interest and concern. But a species with multiple adaptive strategies could theoretically respond to environmental changes much more rapidly and effectively. Exactly correct. Now, let's take this concept several steps further. What if this hypothetical species also developed what we might call cognitive redundancy? Meaning what specifically? Sesesthera asked, her forked tongue tasting the air with obvious anxiety. Multiple different ways of thinking about and approaching problems. Instead of developing a single, highly efficient thought process optimized for their environment, they maintained several different cognitive approaches operating simultaneously. Marcus brought up comparative brain scans from various galactic species, including some carefully selected human examples with identifiers removed. Most sapient species develop highly organized, specialized neural pathways over evolutionary time. Very efficient for processing information in predictable patterns and solving familiar problems. The scans showed clean, organized neural networks with clearly defined pathways and minimal For routine information processing and familiar problem-solving, yes, it would be less efficient, Marcus agreed. But for novel problem-solving, creative adaptation, and responding to completely unexpected challenges, he highlighted specific areas of the brain scans showing activation patterns. Multiple cognitive pathways mean multiple different ways of approaching any given challenge. Grex leaned forward, his massive frame causing his chair to groan under the stress. Are you seriously suggesting that cognitive inefficiency could somehow be an evolutionary advantage? I'm suggesting that what appears inefficient from one perspective might actually be what we call anti-fragile, becoming stronger and more capable under stress rather than weaker. Marcus could see the concepts slowly clicking into place in his students' minds, and their growing alarm as the implications became clear. Professor, Sesthera said slowly, her voice carrying undertones of dawning realization. Are you still speaking purely hypothetically? Marcus smiled, the same expression that had been making his students increasingly nervous over the past few weeks. Let me show you some very real data. He pulled up a new set of files, carefully selected from his classified archives but with all identifying information meticulously removed. These are actual problem-solving scenarios that were presented to various sapient species under controlled laboratory conditions. Each scenario requires innovative solutions to completely novel challenges with no precedent in the subject's experience. The hologram displayed complex three-dimensional puzzles, resource allocation problems under extreme constraints, and strategic challenges with constantly changing parameters. Standard protocol was to give each species representative exactly 1 hour to develop viable solutions using only their natural cognitive abilities. The results appeared on screen in careful anonymized format. Most species showed predictable patterns, logical, systematic approaches that yielded moderately successful solutions within expected parameters. Now observe the results from our hypothetical primitive species, Marcus said quietly. The human results appeared, and the entire lecture hall fell into stunned silence. Where other species showed single, refined solutions developed through systematic analysis, the human responses showed dozens of different approaches, some brilliant, some apparently terrible, but all demonstrating creative and completely unexpected thinking patterns. They developed more viable solutions in 1 hour than most species developed in a full day of analysis, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not just more solutions. Zexhi's internal light flickered rapidly with what Marcus recognized as intense anxiety. This data suggests that cognitive chaos might actually represent a form of advanced intelligence that we don't understand. It suggests, Marcus said very carefully, that our definition of intelligence might be far more limited than we've assumed. The room was completely quiet except for the soft humming of environmental systems and the nervous clicking of Talia's mandibles. Professor? Grex said slowly, his voice carrying new undertones of genuine fear. What species provided these anonymous data samples? Marcus looked directly at the massive Crethan, then at each of his other students in turn. What species do you think? He could see understanding and horror dawning simultaneously in their alien faces. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking together in ways that terrified them. Your assignment for next week, Marcus said as the class period ended, is to completely reconsider everything you've learned about human capabilities in light of today's discussion. I want you to develop entirely new hypotheses about human intelligence, adaptability, and survival strategies. As the students filed out in unprecedented silence, many of them casting fearful glances back at their professor, Marcus knew that Phase 3 was complete. Now came the most dangerous part of his mission. Marcus wasn't surprised when he arrived at his office the next morning to find all 15 of his students waiting in the corridor outside. Their collective body language, despite the incredible variety of species represented, universally conveyed tension, uncertainty, and something approaching fear. The usual casual chatter between different species groups was completely absent, replaced by nervous silence and wary glances. Word had spread throughout the entire xenobiology department about the increasingly disturbing discoveries emerging from Professor Steele's human research assignments. Other faculty members had begun asking pointed questions about his teaching methodology, and Marcus could sense the growing scrutiny from the academic administration. Professor Steele, HFY spoke for the group, their crystalline form pulsing with agitated light patterns that Marcus had never seen before. We need to discuss the serious implications of yesterday's lecture immediately. Of course. Please, all of you, come in. His office wasn't designed to accommodate 15 beings of vastly different sizes and environmental requirements, but they managed to squeeze inside, creating an intimate and potentially volatile atmosphere that Marcus recognized as extremely dangerous to his mission. Tala hung from the ceiling using her natural adhesive abilities, while the larger Crethans pressed against the walls. The smaller species clustered near his desk, their various sensory organs focused intently on him. Grex, as usual, dispensed with diplomatic niceties and went straight to the heart of the matter. Those problem-solving data samples you showed us, they weren't from controlled laboratory subjects, were they? What makes you ask that specific question? The complexity and variety of solutions suggest real-world experience with actual life-threatening survival scenarios, Esthra said. Her serpentine form coiled so tightly with nervous energy that Marcus could hear her scales scraping against each other. Laboratory test subjects don't develop that kind of adaptive creativity under artificial conditions. Marcus nodded slowly, recognizing that his students had progressed much further in their analysis than he had anticipated. You're absolutely correct. Those were field data samples from actual survival situations involving real consequences. A visible ripple of unease went through the cramped room, accompanied by various species-specific stress responses, dimming lights, color changes, and nervous movement patterns. Professor, Tala spoke from her ceiling position, her compound eyes focusing with laser intensity. Some of those scenarios you showed us looked remarkably similar to military tactical problems from advanced warfare. That's a very keen observation. What specifically makes you think that? Resource allocation under active hostile conditions, strategic decision-making with incomplete information and time pressure, adaptive responses to constantly changing threat parameters. Tala's mandibles clicked rapidly as she processed the implications. Those are classic military training scenarios used by the most advanced galactic civilizations. And what conclusion do you draw from that observation? HFY's light pulsed in increasingly rapid patterns. Our conclusion is that humans aren't just more adaptable than we initially assumed. They're actively trained for survival and combat scenarios in ways that other galactic species simply aren't. Marcus walked to his window, looking out at the alien cityscape while carefully considering how much truth he could reveal without completely compromising his position. Let me pose a question to all of you, he said finally, turning back to face the assembled students. How many of your respective species maintain mandatory military service for their civilian populations? The students exchanged uncertain glances across species lines. None, Grex said after a moment. The Crethans maintain a professional warrior caste, but the vast majority of our citizens never receive any form of combat training. Same with the Vexari, HFY added, their crystalline structure resonating with nervous harmonics. Our natural crystalline composition makes us inherently resistant to most forms of physical damage, so we've never developed widespread martial traditions beyond ceremonial purposes. The Salith have traditional combat trials, Esthra said, but they're primarily ritual and cultural rather than practical military training. The Zephyrians focus on collective intelligence and coordination. Tala clicked from above. Individual combat skills are considered primitive and unnecessary. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. And how many of your species teach wilderness survival skills, emergency adaptation protocols, and crisis management to their young as a standard mandatory part of basic education. Again, uncertain looks and negative responses from around the room. We teach efficiency optimization and resource management theory, Tala said slowly, but not practical wilderness survival or crisis adaptation under real-world conditions. The Vexery educational system focuses on information processing and collective decision-making, Zexhai added. Survival skills are considered obsolete in a civilized society. Interesting responses, Marcus said, returning to his desk and pulling up his personal files. Not the fully encrypted ones, but a carefully prepared selection of materials that he'd been saving for exactly this moment. Now, what if I told you that the species we've been studying teaches basic survival skills to all children as mandatory curriculum, maintains citizen military reserves numbering in the hundreds of millions, and considers adaptation to hostile conditions a fundamental life skill rather than specialized knowledge? The room fell into complete, stunned silence. Professor, Sexhai said very carefully, their voice carrying harmonics of dawning horror. What exactly are you telling us? Marcus returned to his desk and activated his holographic display system, showing comparative military capabilities and training protocols across known galactic species, with human data carefully anonymized but clearly visible. I'm telling you that your assumptions about human primitiveness might be more than just academically incorrect, he said quietly. They might be strategically dangerous to your continued existence. The hologram showed detailed analyses of military doctrine, training protocols, and combat effectiveness across the galactic community. Standard galactic military doctrine assumes that technological superiority automatically determines combat effectiveness. Marcus continued, highlighting specific data points. Advanced shields, energy weapons, faster-than-light tactical coordination systems. The display showed typical galactic military formations, equipment specifications, and strategic assumptions. But what if you encountered an enemy force that didn't rely primarily on technological superiority? An enemy that specialized in adaptability, improvisation, and asymmetric warfare tactics. New data appeared. Tactical analyses from historical conflicts throughout galactic history, with species identifiers carefully removed but patterns clearly visible. These are detailed case studies of military conflicts where Grex's orange eyes flared with sudden realization and fear. Professor, these tactical profiles and decision-making patterns, they're virtually identical to the problem-solving approaches you showed us from the human test subjects. Are they? The emphasis on multiple simultaneous approaches, the willingness to accept extremely high-risk strategies, the preference for direct action over defensive measures. Tala's compound eyes shifted rapidly as she processed the terrifying connections. This isn't just adaptive intelligence. This is trained military thinking applied to civilian problem-solving scenarios. Marcus nodded slowly. Now you're beginning to understand why the Galactic Survey Corps' initial reports might have been incomplete. Thera uncoiled with visible effort, her scales shifting to deeper, more alarmed colors. Are you suggesting that humans have been deliberately concealing their true capabilities from galactic civilization? I'm suggesting that if you were a species with significant survival capabilities and adaptive intelligence, would you immediately reveal your full military potential to unknown aliens during first contact scenarios? The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning everything the students thought they knew about galactic civilization and humanity's place in it. Professor, Sexhai said in barely more than a whisper, how long have humans been aware of galactic civilization's existence? Marcus looked at each of his students in turn, then made the decision that would change everything forever. Long enough to have people like me teaching in your most prestigious universities. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute, an eternity in academic discourse, before Grex finally spoke, his voice carrying harmonics of shock, disbelief, and something approaching existential terror. "Professor, are you saying what I think you're saying?" Marcus reached up with deliberate, measured movements and slowly began peeling away the biomask that had concealed his true features for 3 long years. The advanced synthetic proximal skin came away in carefully designed sections, revealing distinctly human characteristics that no amount of cosmetic surgery could completely disguise. The broader nasal structure, the visible whites around his irises, the subtly different bone architecture that marked him as utterly alien to this galactic community. "My name is Marcus James Steele," he said with quiet calm, his voice now carrying the slight accent he had carefully suppressed for years. "I'm from a city called Chicago, located on the 3rd planet of the Sol system. I hold a doctorate in xenobiology from Harvard University, and I've been teaching at this institution for 3 years while operating under deep cover protocols." The reaction was immediate, violent, and species-specific. Zexhi's crystalline form went completely dark, their entire internal light matrix shutting down in what Marcus recognized as their species equivalent of fainting or shock-induced unconsciousness. Thales' compound eyes dilated to maximum aperture, processing threat assessment data at emergency speeds while her mandibles clicked in rapid-fire stress patterns. Thera coiled into a tight defensive posture, her scales shifting to warning colors as ancient predator response instincts overrode her academic training. Grex simply sat motionless, his massive rocky exterior frozen as his orange eyes dimmed to barely visible embers. "You're human?" Thera whispered, her voice barely audible through her stress-constricted throat. "I am. You've been here, among us, studying us, for 3 years. Yes, teaching us about our own biology, while simultaneously gathering detailed intelligence about our species' capabilities, weaknesses, and strategic thinking patterns." Marcus nodded calmly. "Among other things, yes." Grex finally stirred, his rocky exterior grinding and scraping as he shifted position with obvious difficulty. "How many others are there? How many other humans currently operating in deep cover positions throughout galactic civilization?" Marcus asked, noting how the question revealed their assumptions about human infiltration strategies. "Enough to accomplish our objectives. This is an invasion," Tala said, her voice carrying clicking undertones of extreme agitation and barely controlled panic. "You're preparing for systematic conquest of galactic civilization." "Are we?" Marcus asked mildly, walking to his desk with casual confidence. "I've been operating here for 3 years with complete access to classified research data, strategic planning documents, detailed information about every major species' military capabilities and technological weaknesses, and intimate knowledge of galactic political structures. If humans were planning military conquest, wouldn't I have been gathering combat intelligence rather than teaching evolutionary biology to graduate students?" Zexhi's light flickered back to minimal illumination as consciousness slowly returned. "Then what exactly are you doing here?" Marcus activated his holographic display system and pulled up a new dataset, this one showing the true scope of human presence throughout galactic civilization, carefully revealed for maximum psychological impact. "We're integrating," he said with simple directness. The hologram showed hundreds of data points scattered across known space. Human operatives embedded throughout galactic society, but not as military infiltrators. Instead, the display revealed humans working as researchers, engineers, medical specialists, artists, teachers, and civilian administrators in positions throughout the galactic community. Every major galactic institution, government body, research facility, and educational establishment has human personnel in various positions. Marcus continued, manipulating the display to show the extensive network. "We've been quietly contributing to galactic civilization's advancement for over a decade." "Contributing to what specific end?" Grex demanded, his voice carrying new undertones of genuine fear. "To the same end as every other civilized species," Marcus replied smoothly. "Advancement of scientific knowledge, improvement of living conditions across all worlds, and peaceful coexistence between different forms of intelligent life." "Then why the elaborate deception?" He displayed the official records from first contact scenarios, showing the dismissive assessments and prejudicial conclusions drawn by galactic survey teams. When the first galactic survey ships visited Earth, they spent approximately 6 hours conducting orbital scans, performed basic atmospheric and biological sampling, and concluded that humans were a pre-spaceflight species of limited intelligence with no immediate strategic value to galactic civilization. Those assessments weren't technically incorrect, Tala pointed out defensively. You hadn't achieved faster-than-light travel capabilities. No, we hadn't achieved FTL travel, Marcus agreed. But we had achieved something else, something the survey teams never detected because they weren't looking for it. Which was what? Marcus smiled with the expression that had been making his students increasingly nervous over the past several weeks. We had achieved global quantum communication networks, advanced artificial intelligence systems, sophisticated genetic engineering capabilities, controlled fusion power generation, and nanotechnology manufacturing. We simply hadn't seen any strategic advantage to advertising these capabilities to unknown aliens who appeared without invitation in our solar system. The students exchanged glances filled with growing alarm and dawning comprehension. You were already significantly more advanced than the survey reports indicated, Zexai said, their light pulsing with anxiety. Considerably more advanced in several key areas. But we were also intelligent enough to recognize that galactic civilization operates according to certain rigid assumptions about technological development, social organization, and species hierarchy that might not work in humanity's favor. Marcus manipulated the hologram to show the current political and social structure of galactic civilization, highlighting the hierarchical nature of species classification and membership privileges. The Hegemony Council reserves full membership rights for species that demonstrate specific technological and social benchmarks according to their established criteria. Species that don't meet these arbitrary benchmarks are automatically classified as developing and placed under various forms of protective oversight and cultural management. For their own benefit and protection, Grex said defensively, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. According to the species making those determinations, Marcus replied carefully. But what if the benchmarks themselves are culturally biased toward certain types of development? What if there are equally valid, perhaps superior, paths to advancement that the current galactic system doesn't recognize or appreciate? He showed comparative data on different species' development patterns, highlighting the diversity of approaches that had been dismissed or undervalued by galactic standards. Galactic civilization consistently rewards specialization, efficiency, and hierarchical organization, but it systematically penalizes adaptability, redundancy, and distributed problem-solving approaches. Because those traits are demonstrably less efficient, Tala insisted, though her certainty was clearly wavering. In stable, predictable environments, yes, Marcus agreed. But what happens when environments become unstable, unpredictable, or hostile? Marcus pulled up recent galactic political and economic data. Trade disputes, resource conflicts, territorial tensions, and social fragmentation that had been escalating throughout known space over the past few decades. Galactic civilization is becoming less stable and more fractured, not more unified. Climate changes, resource depletion, political fragmentation, cultural conflicts. These are exactly the conditions where human-style adaptability and cognitive flexibility become decisive advantages rather than inefficient alternatives. So you've been systematically infiltrating our institutions to exploit our weaknesses during periods of instability, SSS Thera said, her scales darkening with renewed suspicion. We've been integrating into your institutions to offer our strengths as partners, Marcus corrected gently. There's a significant difference between exploitation and cooperation. He gestured around the room with inclusive warmth. How many scientific problems have I helped you solve during the past 3 years? How many research projects have benefited from my input and alternative perspectives? How many of you have improved your understanding of biological systems because of our discussions and collaborative work? The students couldn't deny the truth of his statement, and their inability to dismiss his contributions clearly frustrated and confused them. The fundamental question you need to ask yourselves, Marcus said quietly, is whether galactic civilization is better served with humans as hidden partners contributing from the shadows, or as excluded strangers working independently outside your systems. The emergency faculty meeting convened 6 hours after Marcus revealed his true identity to his students. Word had spread through the academic community with the devastating speed that only earth-shattering revelations can achieve. The Grand Amphitheater, normally reserved for major conferences and ceremonial occasions, was packed beyond capacity with representatives from every department, species, and academic discipline on campus. The air thrummed with tension, fear, and barely controlled outrage. Dean Vorthe K., an ancient Salith whose scales had long since faded to distinguish silver and whose authority had been forged through decades of navigating complex interspecies politics, called for order with a voice that commanded immediate attention. Her forked tongue tasted the air repeatedly, sampling the complex emotional chemistry of fear, anger, betrayal, and uncertainty that permeated the massive chamber like a toxic fog. Professor Marcus Steele, she announced, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority and personal disappointment. You stand formally accused of falsifying academic credentials, infiltrating a galactic institution under deliberately false pretenses, engaging in systematic espionage activities against multiple sovereign species, and potentially compromising the security of our entire educational system. How do you respond to these serious charges? Marcus stood calmly at the center of the amphitheater's focal point, no longer bothering to conceal his distinctly human features. 3 years of carefully maintained deception had finally ended, and despite the obvious danger to his mission and personal safety, he felt oddly relieved to abandon the pretense that had defined his every interaction. Dean Vorthe K., honored colleagues, distinguished faculty members, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the sophisticated acoustic systems. I acknowledge that I obtained my position here using falsified documentation. I acknowledge that I have deliberately concealed my true species identity for 3 years. But I categorically reject the accusation of espionage or any activities designed to harm galactic civilization. A rumble of skeptical voices arose from the assembled faculty, representing Professor Quintel, a crystalline vexary from the physics department whose internal light pulsed with righteous indignation, chimed with harmonic disapproval that resonated throughout the chamber. You systematically gathered detailed intelligence about our technological capabilities, social structures, and strategic thinking patterns while concealing your own species' true advancement level. That constitutes espionage by any reasonable definition. I gathered knowledge while simultaneously sharing knowledge, Marcus replied firmly. Isn't that the fundamental principle underlying all academic cooperation and scientific advancement? Dean Vorthe K. slithered closer to the center of the amphitheater, her ancient eyes fixed on Marcus with calculating intensity born from decades of academic leadership. The critical question before this assembly is not what contributions you may have made, but what crucial information you have concealed. Your presence here implies that humans possess capabilities far beyond what official galactic surveys indicated. Yes, Marcus said with simple directness. It absolutely does. The frank admission sent another wave of unease and angry muttering through the packed amphitheater. Then humans have been deliberately deceiving galactic civilization about their actual development level, accused Dr. Zephan, a massive Crethan from the engineering department whose orange eyes flared with indignation. This represents a fundamental breach of first contact protocols. Humans have been appropriately cautious about revealing their full capabilities to a galactic civilization that has consistently underestimated, marginalized, and excluded non-conforming species from meaningful participation, Marcus corrected, his voice carrying new steel. He activated his personal holographic projector, displaying carefully prepared data that he had been saving for exactly this moment. In the past 50 years, how many species have been granted full membership status in the Hegemony Council? The answer appeared in stark numerical form: 0. How many species have been successfully reclassified from developing to advanced status in the official galactic hierarchy? Again, the uncomfortable answer: 0. How many species currently under so-called protective oversight have successfully graduated to independent status with full diplomatic recognition? The damning answer hung in the air: 0. Marcus looked around the amphitheater, meeting the eyes of faculty members from dozens of different species. The galactic system claims to be inclusive and merit-based, but the statistical evidence suggests something very different. The oversight system exists to protect developing species from exploitation, Dean Vorthake said, though her voice carried less conviction than usual. Protected by whom? For whose benefit? Marcus asked. The current system creates a permanent hierarchy where the same species that establish the criteria for advancement are the only species that ever qualify for advancement. It's a closed system designed to maintain existing power structures. He manipulated the hologram to show economic and political data spanning several decades. Species under protective oversight provide raw materials, labor, and strategic resources to advanced civilizations while being excluded from technological development, political decision-making, and economic independence. How is this different from sophisticated colonialism? The amphitheater fell uncomfortably quiet as the implications sank in. Furthermore, Marcus continued, humans aren't the only species that has noticed these patterns. We've identified at least 12 other supposedly primitive species that possess capabilities far beyond what galactic surveys indicate. The difference is that humans decided to document the system's biases before revealing our true potential. Dr. Zephan's orange eyes dimmed with growing concern. Are you threatening us? I'm offering you a choice, Marcus said calmly. Continue operating under the assumption that human capabilities don't matter, and eventually discover how wrong that assumption is. Or work with us to create a more equitable system that recognizes different forms of intelligence and development. Dean Vorthake tasted the air again, her ancient wisdom processing the complex political implications. What exactly are you proposing? Full disclosure. Humans reveal our actual capabilities, contribute our technologies and perspectives to galactic civilization, and participate as equal partners in shaping the future. In return, galactic civilization acknowledges that its current evaluation criteria are culturally biased and commits to developing more inclusive standards. And if we refuse? Professor Quintel asked. Marcus smiled, the same expression that had been making his students nervous for weeks. Then humans continue developing independently while galactic civilization wonders why so many primitive species seem to be achieving impossible things. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of species-defining decisions. The choice, Marcus said quietly, is whether galactic civilization grows stronger through diversity and inclusion or fragments through rigid hierarchies and exclusion. But understand this, with or without galactic approval, humanity will continue to advance. The only question is whether we do it together or separately. As the faculty members began heated discussions in dozens of languages and communication methods, Marcus knew that regardless of their decision, the galaxy would never be the same again. The age of human secrecy was over. The age of human partnership was about to begin.